Welcome everyone to one of our Clean Cities webinars here. Today we're going to be talking about grants and going to be sharing some tips and strategies to help you have a winning application. There's a lot of funding coming out over the next year. If y'all have been paying any attention, there's a lot going on, and we want to try to give you a heads up to what's coming your way and then help you get ready for it, because the best proposals are the ones that you already know what you want ahead of time and that you are prepared for. So today, the group we have here, we have a fantastic group of presenters representing 3 Clean Cities coalitions and the Center for Sustainable Energy, which also hosts their own Clean Cities coalition. So your agenda is here. First, we're going to be talking about open and revolving grants. We're going to go through the grant process. Then we're going to talk about the partnerships that you need in order to have a really good, successful application. And then Megan's going to dig into the plan and what you need to have to make sure that you're organized and you have a thoughtful proposal. And then we'll do some Q&A with all of you, so you can ask us your toughest questions. So what is Clean Cities? Many of you, if you've been coming to our webinars, you've heard this presentation many, many times. But for those of you who may not be familiar with us, we're a Department of Energy program. So within the Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Division of the Department of Energy, there is the Vehicle Technology Office. And within the Vehicle Technology Office, they develop and advance transportation technologies. So there's batteries and electrification, materials, energy efficient mobility systems, where you look at transportation through kind of like a broader lens, not just the vehicles, but the actual systems and how they all interact, and the actual real world applications of these technologies and how they work with one another. You know, engines and fuels, and under that is technology integration, and the Clean Cities program is nestled within the Technology Integration Department. And the VTO office often has some really great vehicle deployment and infrastructure deployment grants, research grants. They have a lot of living labs that help to study the implications of all the different technologies and help us to improve things. There's safety training, the works. So this is one of the areas that you really need to look out for grant opportunities, and you definitely want to partner with your Clean Cities Coalition for these, because that really gives you a heads up on your application. So who is Louisiana Clean Fuels? Your host today. We are a Clean Cities Coalition that has been around since year 2000, and we cover most of the state of Louisiana. We do have a sister coalition that covers the remainder of the territory, and that is the Southeast Louisiana Clean Fuel Partnership. So the entire state of Louisiana is covered by Clean Cities, and we are here to help you with your clean transportation projects. You're going to be hearing a lot about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Some people call it the IIJA or the IJA. And there's also some other acronyms going around. Some people call it the bill, bipartisan infrastructure law, but it's all the same thing. So your next presenter, Tyler, will be speaking a lot about the different grants. We want to let you know that your Clean Cities Coalition is your first source for getting up-to-date information on what is going on with the IJA or the infrastructure bill, whatever you call that. So today your presenters are Tyler Herman. He is the co-coordinator here at Louisiana Clean Fuels. Then we have Daniel Succé with East Tennessee Clean Fuels, Zach Hinken with the Center for Sustainable Energy, and Megan Stein with Clean Fuels Ohio. Thank you all for joining us today.
Good morning, go ahead.
Yeah, so first up we have Tyler, and he will be covering current and upcoming funding programs. Here you go, Tyler.
Yes, good morning, everybody. Tell you a little bit about some of the upcoming and current programs that we have available in terms of grants and incentives. But first, I just want to show the Alternative Fuel Data Center, which is one of the best resources in the entire industry for keeping up with current grant opportunities, incentives, regulations, laws, and then just general information about all the alternative fuels. We live and die by this website, and it is absolutely wonderful. So just wanted to show you that there is a laws and incentives page here that has a pretty extensive and pretty holistic list of all of the programs on a federal level and a state by state level. So I used this extensively while actually preparing for this presentation today. So absolutely fantastic resources. Wanted to make sure that you'll have in front of you. And one thing I'll mention up front is that I'm going to talk a lot about 3 major programs we have in the federal government right now. And there's more information on these slides than I can reasonably talk about quickly. So this is really for reference later on. Don't worry if you can't read some of the text on one of the graphics or 2. So you can move on, Anne. So as I mentioned, the infrastructure bill is really one of the most important programs we have right now in the alternative fuel world. It has an incredible amount of money available for different alternative fuel programs. And I'm primarily going to talk about 3 of these programs that are really relevant to us today. So as many of you may know, there are $7.5 billion available for alternative fuel infrastructure across the federal government. That is an incredible number. It's separated into 2 different pots that we'll mostly be talking about. The first one, the $5 billion for the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, sometimes called NEVI. That's primarily what I talk about at the beginning. It is $2.5 billion for competitive community fueling projects. We don't have as much information about what this is going to look like yet, but these will be competitive grant programs for community electric vehicle charging. It's half of that funding. And then the other half will be available for all alternative fuel infrastructure. We don't really know exactly what that's going to look like yet, but we're expecting more information later on in the year. And then there's $5 billion for the EPA Clean Bus program. This is again split up into 2 different pots, half each. $2.5 billion for zero emission buses. This is electric or battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell buses, and then $2.5 billion for clean buses. And I'll kind of talk about what that means later on in the presentation. And then there's $1.5 billion this year for Federal Transit Administration's low no emission program, which I'll also dig a little bit more into in the future. Next slide. So for the NEVI funds, this is a timeline of events. Really the important part here is that we have the guidance now from the Joint Office that tells us what sorts of projects can be funded by this. And the next major deadline we have is on May 13th, when we get the minimum standards for the program. That'll give a little bit more about what we actually have to do with the funds. And then the state plans are due on August 1st, and that's going to tell us on a state-by-state basis what's going to happen with the funding. So the funds are distributed to the states according to the Federal Highway Administration's formula. So this is used for basically all Federal Highway Administration funding. And the breakdown, just for the 3 states that are represented here today, are $73.4 million for Louisiana, $140 million for Ohio, and $88 million for Tennessee. There's a link in the presentation there for where you can find the state-by-state breakdown, so you can look that up for your relative state if you'd like to. And these are distributed to the Departments of Transportation in the states. They'll be managing the funds there. Just for a bit of reference here, this is just out of the $5 billion portion at $7.5 billion. And Louisiana had available to it $2.7 million from the Volkswagen settlement for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. This is like 45 times that. And that Volkswagen settlement took probably 30 years off of my life. So I can't even imagine what 73.4 million is going to do. But here we are, we're prepared, we're working on it. So the funding is going to be distributed in roughly equal portions over 5 years. So this gives us time to prepare for future application windows, but they are really hoping to get this first round out later this year, which is pretty exciting. All these funds require a 20% match in terms of private investment. This is a pretty big change from normal federal stuff, which might require 50% match. So only needing 20% is actually really, really good. And it could be used for installation, the actual equipment cost, and maintenance cost for 5 years on these programs, which is pretty incredible. Next slide, please. Oh, and there's also driveelectric.gov, which is a new website for all of these funds. So as I have on the previous slide but didn't say out loud, this funding can only be used for corridor development, at least initially. And corridors have new requirements now under the Alternative Fuel Corridor program that you may be familiar with. So these stations are going to have to fit the criteria of being situated such that they're no more than 50 miles between stations or between sites, no more than 1 mile from interstate exits, that's as the car drives, which is very, very close. And the stations must include 4 plugs capable of charging at 150 kilowatts simultaneously. That's a huge amount of site power. That's minimum 600 kilowatts of site power. And that's going to require some significant upgrades. Really, really rough approximation for station cost is going to be about $700,000 per site. Just a really rough approximation. So these are going to be the initial projects that are eligible for those funds. Next slide, please. And then just a last little bit of kind of sum up information here about the NEVI funds. We're going to get the final set of minimum requirements on May 13th. So that is just around the corner. The state plans are due August 1st, and then the Highway Administration has to approve or deny those plans by September 30th. So things are moving very, very, very quickly with these funds. The applications for the funds actually may be available as soon as late 2022. So we're looking at a very, very short lead time to get these projects kind of put together. And we're going to talk about how to do that in the other presentations today. And then just a huge plug for the Clean Cities newsletters to keep track of this sort of stuff. So we also have the EPA Clean School Bus program. This is a great program as well. It's $5 billion for electric buses, and it's split half and half between zero emission buses, electric and maybe hydrogen, and in clean buses, which is any alternative fuel. And they have some criteria written down in the guidance that talks about emissions reductions and that they might prioritize higher emissions reductions. It's not super clear if they're looking at NOx emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. That's going to come down later on as we learn more and the RFPs go out. But that's still a huge chunk of change for all alternative fuels. The funding is also going to be available over a 5-year program, $1 billion per year, just like with the NEV Funds. And the really important thing here is that this funding may provide up to 100% of the cost of the bus and its fueling infrastructure, which is incredible. That is a huge, huge percentage of the cost. That's all of the percentage of the cost. So this is really, really great for a lot of communities. And they're going to be focusing on rural and low income communities as a major priority of the program. So this can really get some funding out in, Louisiana is all rural, really. So this is a huge bit of news for us. So we're very excited about that. Next slide, please. In terms of when we might expect this stuff, the first round is actually expected to open in late April 2022. That's the month that we're about to walk into. So if you're thinking about any of this, be thinking about it faster because it is very, very, very soon. But again, we're going to have 4 more rounds of this in the coming years to prepare. The first round of this funding is going to be a rebate program, very, very similar to the DERA Act or Diesel Emissions Reductions Act program. This is mostly from the EPA side to smooth the process along. They know how to do that program. They've been doing it for several years. That is just to kind of speed up this initial process and get money out the door sooner rather than later. Later rounds of this may not be the same sort of format. That'll come down in guidance later on in the year, hopefully. And then there's also still DERA funding available every year, which you should be aware of. That can be used for alternative fuel buses. One kind of caveat there is that DERA funding requires the destruction of the old diesel buses, so it cannot be used to expand your fleet. In the next slide, please. So we're moving on to the Federal Transit Administration funding. For just the fiscal year of 2022, there's $1.5 billion available. Separated into 2 pots, as everything seems to be. $1.1 billion for competitive grants for the Low-No program, which can be used to purchase or lease zero or low emission transit buses. And this can also be used for acquisition, construction, and leasing of required supporting facilities. So this can help bring maintenance facilities up to snuff for a new fuel, which is pretty big as well. And then there's $372 million of competitive grants under the Buses and Bus Facilities program that can be used for all fuels, not just alt fuels. So it can be used for diesel transit buses as well. And then for zero emission projects from either program, 5% of the requested funds must be used for workforce development. So this is to train mechanics to work on the new fuel types, train drivers on how to operate them, all that sort of stuff as well. So there's a lot of workforce development focus in this program. And applicants must have a zero emission fleet transition plan. This is a whole thing that we won't go into today, but there is a link to where the actual requirements are for that and what it includes. It's basically showing that your transit fleet has basically a plan in place to figure out how you're going to move towards zero emission vehicles in the future. Next slide. These programs, they can cover 80% of project costs, which is, again, very high for federal funding. So that's good news. And applicants can apply for both of these programs simultaneously or each of them individually. But the total federal funds cannot exceed 80% of the project costs because there's always that 20% private industry or state funding match that's required under federal programs. And then there's a link to more information about that as well. Next slide. And then my last slide today, some other funding programs. We have the DERA funds. Your state may have Volkswagen settlement funds available still. Louisiana does not. So I apologize, but that ship has sailed in Louisiana. There is the EPA Ports Initiative, which is also part of the infrastructure bill. And then there are also various state programs you can find at the AFDC. And then I've put some of the links that we've talked about today down at the bottom there just for quick reference. And that's all I have. A lot of funding available, and the rest of the people today are going to tell you how to prepare for that.
Thank you, Tyler. And yes, the slides will be made available after the webinar, and we are recording this, and we will post the recording on our YouTube channel. And we will also be sharing it with all the other presenters so they can post it as well. Would like to encourage you all, before we transition over to Daniel, to put your questions in the Q&A, and we will get to all your questions once the presentations are over. And Daniel, I'm passing it off to you now to talk about the grant process.
Thank you very much, Anne. Happy to be here. I'm Daniel Sixay, Chief of Staff of East Tennessee Clean Fuels, one of Tennessee's 2 Clean Cities coalitions. I want to talk to you today about essentially the grant process, getting grant ready. What are you going to need to do, and what are you going to need to prepare for when you are applying for some of the upcoming funding for implementation, infrastructure, vehicles, or other development projects that are going to be funded over the coming year or 3. The first thing I want to talk about is just give you a basic overview of the steps of the grant application process. And if you could go to the next slide, that'd be great. Thank you. So these are the basic elements of almost every proposal that you're going to be putting forward for the funding that's coming out. The one that's kind of a little bit more depending on the funding opportunity is the concept paper, and that's basically a really quick summary of what you plan to do. There's also I also want to talk about the full proposal, letters of commitment, intent, and support, project cost share, budgeting for the project, indirect costs for nonprofit organizations, and then talk a little bit about pass-through funds. Next slide, please. So I'll just quickly talk about the concept paper because it's not going to be a thing for some of the grant opportunities that are coming your way. These are usually 2 or 3 pages, and this is the time when you're ideating about the project, getting a sense of what it's going to look like and who you're going to involve, that you want to gather as many project partners as you can. You don't need to flesh it out entirely. This is, again, 2 or 3 pages summarizing what you want to do, but the more detail you can fit into those 2 or 3 pages, the better. One of the most important things to note here is that you read the funding announcement carefully. I can't tell you how many times I've looked at concept papers that don't actually answer some of the basic questions that are asked in the FOA. So in particular, make sure that you mirror language. If they ask a specific question, put that question in your project, in your concept paper, and then answer it directly. Include a list of all the project partners broken up into the different segments of research, implementation, community engagement that your project is going to take on. Graphics are nice just to break it up a little bit and show that you've kind of thought geographically, like a map, for example, about how your project is going to work. And then you want to frame your project as a clear, helpful answer to a problem or an issue presented by the funding announcement. Next slide. Thank you. Just some very basic tips and tricks, and these are going to be helpful when you're writing the full proposal as well. Make sure any abstract concepts that you're using are grounded in concrete examples. Make sure it's clear that your organization is experienced, if you are, in the kind of work that you're doing. Know your audience. EPA, DOT, DOE, they're all going to have different processes, and they're all going to have different goals for their organizations. So make sure you understand what that grant entity is looking for, and both in terms of the particular FOA and the overall goals of the organization. And then reference previous projects. If you've worked on previous projects, mention them that are similar to this grant, or if you know of other projects that exist that you might be able to build off of and build it into part of your concept paper, saying we're building off this previous successful project, do that. Reference something that's already happened to show that you're engaged in the history of this issue. And make sure you have positive potential outcomes and outputs. Make that very clear. You want to make sure that when someone reads that concept paper, they get a sense of exactly what you want to do and what good it's going to do. So I'm not going to go into detail here. When Anne shares these slides around, you'll be able to see it, but I've actually taken a piece of what some of the successful grant applications we've put in, and you can take a look at how we structured it. You need not structure it in the same way that we did, but you can take a look. So the full proposal. First part of a full proposal, or a major part, is the statement of project objectives, or the SOPO. This is kind of the first swipe you're going to take at really itemizing all the things that are going to happen in your project, both in terms of internal administration, the programmatic work that you're going to do, all the deliverables and the milestones that you want to reach over the life of the project. All of that goes into here. Make sure you're identifying the project objectives and summarize them really well at a high level. Make sure that you provide a couple paragraphs of pure summary that's just talking about everything you're going to do. Establish your scope of work. Get a sense of how much time this is going to take. Contact people if you're going to be working on vehicle orders or infrastructure orders, or if there's some time that's going to be spent developing surveys or other outreach materials. Make sure you're envisioning that properly and realistically in your proposal. Make sure that your project milestones are reasonable and something that's going to be accepted by the granting entity. And then make sure you list all deliverables that are required by your funding announcement and plan for your project. Don't leave stuff out that they're looking for in that original funding opportunity announcement. They're looking for people to answer the specific information that they've provided in that FOA. Next slide, please. So here is another example of just a small part of a SOPO that we've developed for another grant, and I'll let you take a look at that when you take a look at the slides. Next slides, please. The technical volume. Now, the technical volume is a supporting piece of your SOPO, and it's the place where you really develop the narrative and the technical details of the proposal. So, along with the scope and task and deliverables, this is where you're going to sell the project. You're going to tell the grant entity, this is exactly how it's going to work. We've thought it through. We understand all the details. Here's how it's going to go. This is going to involve the most work of any project or any document you've developed for the project you're working on thus far. You need to develop each phase of the project if you're going to have phases. You need to describe in detail the project impact and potential benefits. You need to visualize the project schedule. We often will use a Gantt chart to visualize the timeline for each of the different deliverables of the project. And then you need to develop a first draft of a project management plan that is going to be used to keep the project on track. When things are going to be done, how they're going to be done, how you're going to facilitate the interactions between you, the prime applicant, and potential subrecipients, potential vendors. All that stuff should be thought about here in the full proposal. Next slide, please. Another example of something you might see in terms of narrative in a technical volume. I'll let you take a look when the slides are distributed. Next slide, please. Sorry, and I'm still seeing the example slide.
It's advanced. It's showing up on my end.
Oh, okay. I'll
Full proposal tips and tricks.
Thank you. I'll zoom to my slides right here. Okay. So when you're writing your full proposal, integrate your project with tools provided by the granting entity. If you're working with DOE and you need to be doing something that involves outreach and letting people know about EV charging stations, don't use ChargePoint in your proposal. Use the Alt Fuels Station Locator, which is developed by DOE. If there are resources or mapping tools or ArcGIS tools or other tools that those entities have developed, use those. It's going to make your grant entity happy. Whenever possible, figure out who's doing the work. There's going to be some holes in every proposal in terms of figuring out exactly who's going to be doing what and which partners you might be bringing on at a later date. But as much as possible, trying to figure out if this entity is going to be doing the work, name them, describe the work that they're going to be doing. Emphasize how the project is going to positively impact the mission or the goals of the grant entity. Don't leave out that piece. Make sure that this not only attends to the FOA, but attends to the overall mission of the current administration at DOE or the grant entity that you're talking about. Take note of any new approaches that you're going to be developing or new strategies that you're going to use for implementation. Make sure you highlight those. Novel things are going to get people's attention. And then the last thing I want to say about this is make sure not only do you just have a bunch of statements about what this project is, turn it into a narrative. When you're writing about what the project is going to do, you're selling it. You're not just describing it. So make sure you're explaining the context of the program. Make sure you're providing people with the information that they need to understand the impacts of the project, and what problems they're going to be addressing within a community. Next slide, please. Letters of commitment, intent, and support. Now, not all projects are going to require this, but most do. So you are most likely going to require all of your participating partners, especially subrecipients and vendors, to provide a letter of commitment or intent that summarizes the work they're going to do for the project and details any cost share that'll come later that they plan to provide for the project. Some FOAs are also going to ask for letters of support, which they don't require any work on the part of the writing organization. They just say, hey, we're a community organization, or we're this entity. We support the goals of this project. The more of those you can get, if letters of support are allowed, the better it's going to look. If you have massive community buy-in for your project, that's going to look really good. To make your life easier, just send them a template. Don't ask them to draft something from scratch. Trust me, it's going to become a headache as you're waiting on people to draft that letter. Give them the exact language that they're supposed to use. They can modify it as they see fit, but give them the template. And one very important thing to note when you're having discussions with organizations about participating in these grant projects, just make sure to let them know that if there's some hesitation on their part, let them know that this letter of intent or letter of commitment doesn't actually legally commit them to participating in the project. They can pull out if the project is awarded and you can find someone else to do the work. But that letter of commitment is basically just to say, hey, we've had conversations with this organization. As it stands right now, they are going to be able to do the work that we are proposing for the project, and they would be a good fit for it. They can pull out later on if they're feeling a little antsy. Next slide, please. Cost share. Now, as Tyler mentioned, there are quite a few different kinds of cost share that can be leveraged for a grant program. You often see some projects requiring a 50% cost share. Many of them are even higher than that. Although the grants that Tyler mentioned, the cost share for vehicle purchases or for infrastructure purchases is actually pretty low. 70 to 100% in some cases of is what would be provided by the federal government. But you want to make sure that if there is a cost share requirement, you know exactly where it's going to come from, or at least have a really good idea. You want to collect more cost share commitment than is required, since it's almost certain there's going to be bumps in the road. One of your community implementation organizations, if you're working with 4 different ones, is going to have an issue. Either they're not going to produce the cost share that you're expecting, they're going to have to pull out entirely. The work that they had is going to evaporate for some internal administrative reason. It's always going to happen. So make sure you have backup cost share at your service for something like this. And remember, if you are the prime applicant, that is the contracting agent with the DOE or whatever grant entity you're working with. The buck stops with you. If your cost share partners don't come through, that's not their fault. Ultimately, when the project is held accountable for producing its cost share, you are the entity that is responsible, no one else. Next slide, please. When you're building your project's budget, you're going to want to break down personnel, including overhead and indirect costs, overhead rates, equipment costs, contractual costs for subrecipients and vendors, indirect rates if you're a nonprofit organization, cost share from all participating organizations. Think really carefully about how you're going to compensate your subrecipients, if there are subrecipients in your proposal. If your project is complicated, sometimes tracking by time, the number of hours that each organization works based on hourly rates, can get really confusing. And if it's possible to build in a task-based compensation system where someone produces a deliverable or an output, and then are paid a flat rate on that basis, that can be really a lot simpler in certain circumstances. So think carefully about how you want to structure how the money is going to flow through you to other potential partners. Next slide, please. And hold on, it hasn't updated for me again.
It's there. It's building a helpful budget justification.
Yes, you may need to provide estimates of the number of hours that each participating member of your organization will need to commit to the project. The way I think about this is I think about, okay, how many full-time employees are required to see the project to completion? If we assume that a full-time employee works 2,080 hours per year, how much of that employee's time is going to be taken up in a year working on this project? Is it going to be half a year? Is it going to be 1/10 of a year? Is it going to be 2 years and thus you need 2 full-time employees? Do those calculations early on so you have a good sense of what you're about to take on if the grant is awarded. Keep in mind that the number of employees you include in your budget justification can change if you need to add on new staff later on, as long as you're still within the budget numbers you provided. If you only said that 2 employees were going to work on the project and all of a sudden that needs to be 4, you can split up the time that you, the budget dollars that you put in for personnel right there. And then you'll be held to those calculations. You can make changes to the budget mid-project, but it is not easy and it's going to give you a headache. So make sure you really think through how much money it's going to cost you to administrate this project that you're proposing. Otherwise, you may end up funding some of that project all by yourself. Indirect cost rates, really quickly. I know that there are some nonprofit organizations on here, and if you're smaller, you may not have developed a federally approved indirect cost rate yet. And that will leave you to only be able to choose something like a de minimis rate at around 10% of your indirect cost rates on top of all the personnel time that you're going to be charging for. But if you develop an accurate and thorough independent or indirect cost rate and present that with your proposal, you may be able to collect your indirect cost rates through the grant that you receive, and instead of just going with that 10% de minimis rate. It's a significant opportunity for your coalition to recoup some of its operating costs as it administrates a grant or a funding opportunity in your area. They're complicated things to put together, but given the amount of money that's going to be coming out in the next 3 years, the time to start doing that is now. Next slide, please. Last one is pass-through funds. If your organization is going to pass through funds to subrecipients, vendors, anyone else, you want to make sure that you have your fiscal system set up, make sure you have ACH payments ready to go. Some entities, again, if you're a nonprofit, you may be able to charge a certain logic of indirect cost rates to the money that passes through. Make sure you do those calculations. Make sure you know exactly how much you can charge to pass through money, and make sure you're not charging more so an audit reveals something later on that you should have avoided. And make sure if you are going to be dealing with pass-through money, you build in extra administrative time. It doesn't sound like much, just receiving money and passing it on, but the amount of paperwork for that kind of stuff is surprisingly large, and it can take some time. That was a really fast overview of all the stuff that you might need to do for a grant. Obviously, the information on these slides will be available after the fact. I'm also available to answer your questions both in this webinar right now and also just on the phone or by email. If you have a question about what's it going to take for you to take on a grant proposal in the next 2 years, give me a shout and we'll be able to talk.
Thank you so much, Daniel.
Thanks.
So before we go on to Zach, if Daniel's presentation made your head swim and made you now terrified of being a prime applicant for a grant, we understand. And that is exactly why all of us are here today, to let you know that, Zach is going to talk about this very subject is, how do you partner for success? Say you have a really good idea, but you don't want to be this person in charge of pass-through dollars or budget justifications or SOPO writing. You just want to be part of it and help it. You need to have the right partners. You need to have the right grant writing team. And Zach is going to be here today to get you started on helping you down that road. Zach?
Thanks, Anne, and kudos, Daniel and Tyler, for all of the coverage. My head wasn't quite spinning, but oh my gosh, you covered quite a bit. So hi all, I'm Zach Kempkin. I lead EV research for the Center for Sustainable Energy. We're a nonprofit that I'll talk about a little bit more in the next slide. So CSE is a C3 nonprofit. I was looking at this slide here, which I really like because it reflects national interaction. I think we have a delay with the web, but just the conversation I had the other day about how we would deliver education if we were leading on a new grant or leading on a new proposal on how to deliver EV education for a low moderate income community, or just in general. I mean, the typical strategy would be, how can you partner with Thanks, there it is. The people who have already been doing the work on the ground, who have those relationships, who can bring all of that local information that you might miss. I think a theme that I was just thinking about as I was queuing up here is time. Generally, when you have an opportunity that comes out, you're looking it out on the calendar, you're delaying probably a week, 2 weeks, a month, and then you never actually have enough time to put together something at the quality, at the level that you could with the ultimate potential. In the right partnerships, not only can they bring their perspective, their relationships, but also all the time that they've invested into doing that work. So go to the next slide, please. So using a bit of the same example that Daniel was indirectly referencing, we had this challenge recently with workplace charging opportunity. So, early on, and my background is workplace charging, I put, a tremendous amount of time into it. We saw this federal opportunity, and quickly it was like, how can we best manage and deliver on this large scale implementation project? And that's the genesis. It's like, we know, like, okay, we want to have a large scale impact. How do we do that? Great, we need local perspective, we need regional perspective, we need practical experience. And, of course, bonus points if they have had anything to do with previous workplace charging or EV experience just in general. So with that, talking with some partners, quickly came to the realization that, well, gosh, we have to partner with clean cities, and not just clean cities, but as many clean cities as we can. Let's go to the next slide. So in this case, we kind of did this crazy thing of literally partnering with as many clean cities as we can, scooping up around 30 partners. And I know that this webinar is not about this project or this proposal, but I think it's a unique mention that kind of really underscores the reason why you want to partner. So here we have, again, around 30 plus clean cities around the country, representing different geographies, representing urban and rural, representing different cultures, different all kinds of different circumstances. And with that, they bring the perspective and background to kind of add this multi-layer crowdsourced approach where if you're managing it right, it can be fantastic. If you're managing it wrong, it's a tremendous amount of subcontractors and partners that you have to, it's literally like herding cats. But if you do it right, it can be, again, doing something amazing that no one's done before. So next slide. How it's going. So we did win this work. And with that, I like this slide because it also represents many of the partners that came with these relationships. Each of these Clean Cities chapters has a board, they have community relationships, they have utilities in their area, community-based organizations in the area, and typically they will maintain all of these relationships, and if it's pursuant to their mission, be happy to work with them with you. I had a meeting just a couple of weeks ago at the North American Dealer Association, and I'm talking with this person who is in Alabama about seeking resources, trying to get up to speed on what's going on locally, and seeking to advance and get incentives for their own projects. They're a dealer. They would love to install DC fast charging. What's the quickest way so that their sites are seen as the low-hanging fruit for future IIJA funds? I'm on the West Coast in the Portland area. I know a little bit about Alabama, but not as much as the relationship that I connected him to. I pulled up the Clean Cities chapter on my phone. He screenshotted it, and then away you go, because I know that they'll be able to manage that a lot better than I would. Next slide, please. Partnerships make projects happen. So what was mentioned in a couple places was the need for cost share. IIJA has a requirement of 20% cost share, and with that, I think it is very smart to identify where that cost share is coming from. This slide, this image I'm using in particular is kind of reflects what that partnership could be, because what we have is, we have the CEO of EVgo, Kathy Zoy. We have a fourth regional nonprofit. We have a lobbyist, and someone from the Department of Transportation for Washington State. All of this, the confluence, is what made a big pod of DC fast chargers happen at SeaTac, at the airport in Seattle, because everyone is seeing on their own different element what they have to do to benefit. And when you're each having a co-benefit, then that marginal cost that you're contributing is not that bad. Additional things that we need to take into consideration are just all the other stuff that we might not prioritize in our own delivery. You know, how is that going to be communicated? How is that going to be leveraged for any other relationships? And so on and so on. Each site, for when you're talking about a DC fast charger, it can just ripple out, that can then ultimately lead to greater utilization, greater success of that project, and that you might not even see immediately. So a utility is in this for typically the long game, and they want to make sure that that is getting uptime and it is being used by the community, is being highly visible. Those things just don't happen, but tapping into people along the way could help make sure and reinforce that the right steps are taken. If you were trying to do this as a one-person shop or as one organization, you would have a tremendously difficult time. It's much easier if you kind of crowdsource it out with willing participants who are happy to raise your hand and participate. Next slide. A bit of a focus on equity, because equity, when you're trying to focus on advancing an equity project in particular, it takes even more time. My kind of shorthand of engaging on equity projects has been that if you're engaging with a local community-based organization or a local environmental justice organization, you can shortcut some of that time because they have deep roots with with the community. If I'm going in as an external organization, I want to build relationships with the community. I can probably anticipate a lack of trust or an uphill battle, at least, to challenge to as I try to learn and discover and take in more information. A community-based organization often will have those relationships. They will probably play a vetting role on who they want to engage with, because their role and their trust with the community is paramount. But I really like this slide and this approach from the Greenlining Institute, which is their mobility equity framework, where I won't read every line, but ultimately that if you can have community buy-in and community design early into a project, you will have that a better project that will reflect the community's values. So again, like if I'm channeling everything, it's like we never have enough time for these projects. But if you legitimately want to have something that is benefiting the community, and that's part of your approach, then that's one of the things you probably want to start first. If there's a local community-based organization, see how you can gather their input in a good way, and then go along, because that's an excellent way to deliver great work. Next slide. A not so good way to do work is pushing the money out and then just throwing a project together. This slide, thankfully, is not from the US, but it does reflect a bit of how, you know, the industry has installed charging sometimes when we're in a rush. And for those driving EV, you know that there are some DC fast chargers or just chargers in general that are at sites that are just not places that you want to be. This is, I believe, at a cemetery. And I know at least a few DC fast chargers at cemeteries in Oregon. But when we're talking about the future federal funds, this huge swath of money coming down that will impact how people are driving EV for the next probably 5 to 10 years, we want to proactively think about where we want those DC fast chargers, where we want those level 2s, because that is going to be affecting people who are they're going to be recommending EV to their friends, neighbors, family members, et cetera. And like, if we're doing this right, we can take data-driven solutions, we can take community input to make sure that these chargers are sited in the best possible way so that they're safe, they're getting highly visible with lighting that's 24/7, there's bathrooms, there's food, there's all the accompanying things that you want to have. And then we're just putting in chargers in the ground because we need to have one at that specific stop. Okay, and then last slide. This I like. This slide I like. This is representing all of the clean cities across the country. There are lots of them, and what I like about this, because it gives me a chance just to talk one more time about clean cities in general. Each individual organization, I can tell you, is different. They have different capacities, they have different values, they have different focuses, but what I think they all have in common is a local perspective that I oftentimes as an outsider cannot keep. So I would say, really, with encouragement, if there is a first call that you should make when you're engaging in a project, I would call a clean city. And I wouldn't necessarily think that they can always do the work, they're always the partner, but I would believe that they probably know the right people to connect you with, if that's something that you're looking forward to advance. So last slide for me is the next one, and I will hand this off to Megan.
Thank you so much, Zach. And thank you for the plug. We always appreciate it. All right, next up is Megan, who's going to talk to you about creating your plan. Megan, you are up.
Thank you so much, Anne, and great to be speaking with everyone today. I'm going to be talking to you today, just like Anne said, about creating the plan and what goes into that process for your organization. So next slide, please, Anne. So when we talk about pre-release planning here, what do we mean? I think, when you're thinking conceptually about funding opportunities, it's kind of like, well, don't we need to wait until the funding opportunity is released to be able to plan how we're going to go after that opportunity or that funding? Not necessarily. So for a number of years, our organization has really focused on considering what our mission is. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, and we're mission driven. So it's really thinking about what is our mission and what kind of projects can we think about ahead of a funding opportunity being released. What kinds of projects would we be interested in? Who are the kinds of partners that we would potentially collaborate on these projects? So, why is pre-release planning important? It brings voices to the table. It ensures there's alignment on thinking and allows for more collaborative and potentially a more collaborative process and potentially less competition, right? So, if you're in your state or even in your region, if you're thinking of a concept or a project, if you're bringing those voices to the tables of the like-minded organizations, you could potentially come up with a project together. And so you're not necessarily competing with each other. So how do we do this pre-release planning? Like I mentioned, our organization, we meet annually, usually at the beginning of the year, ahead of any funding opportunities that come out, and we convene our entire staff and a number of times bring in our stakeholders, sometimes our board members, to really kind of think through what kind of projects we want to focus on for the upcoming year and then the years to come, since a lot of these projects are multi-year. And then if you're a larger agency, how do you do that? You could convene working groups. You could have regional partner engagement as well. Next slide, Anne. So interestingly, I'm going to propose this idea to you all when you're thinking about putting together a project. And so I like to think about it, and the way we've attacked this process in the past has been to work backwards. So I think, it can, a lot of folks might be interested in the idea of, you have this idea and you want to just start writing. You just want to start with this technical volume. But I actually don't recommend doing that. I think you might want to think about this project from the end and then work your way actually forward. So really what that means working backwards is to develop the statement of project objectives on the front end. So what are your milestones going to be in your project? What are your goes and no-goes during each of the project years? So if you can outline those key milestones, tasks, and objectives, it'll help you really during the process of writing the technical volume, which is really the meat and potatoes of the application. You really want to identify those key partnerships. Who's going to support the project? Is it going to be, national partnerships? Is it regional partnerships? Is it just within your state? So keeping that in mind too, on the front end of the project development. How will those specific partners support the project? Are they a subrecipient to the project? Are they a vendor? What does that mean? And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. What's the difference between a subrecipient and a vendor? Then you want to think about the budget. And so I put an emphasis on this mostly because the years that I've been at Clean Fuels Ohio, I've spent a lot of years working on budgets. And Daniel mentioned this a bit, but it's really important to put a lot of thought and strategy into that budget. So, simple things that you wouldn't necessarily think about is, when you're putting in the personnel line item into your budget, make sure you're including a 3 to 5% even raise year over year salary adjustment for the employees in your budget. If you're not including that, you can't ask DOE for more money later on. So you're going to have to rob Peter to pay Paul somewhere else in your budget if you don't include something like that. So, best to build in things like that. Another thing that's really important to build in, if you're an organization and you're receiving federal funds in excess of $750,000, make sure you build in money for that project to help support an audit for you, specifically the federal audit, the A133 audit. We are currently, like in this very moment, going through our federal audit, so I can speak directly to that. And it's expensive, right? So make sure that each one of your federal projects is paying for a portion of that. So build that into your budget. Just don't forget those little things. And I have a lot of tips and tricks about what you want to make sure to include in your budget. And do include, like I mentioned, salary adjustments, potential increases in fringe expense, which would be healthcare. I mean, heaven knows the healthcare expense has gone up exponentially year over year. So make sure you're putting those types of considerations into your budget. And then really the last step here is kind of the technical volume. So that's where you want to kind of end this process, is getting all the pieces and parts together, then start the writing of the technical volume. Next slide, Ann. So finding the right fit, this is really important. Identifying those key partnerships with the project. It's important to identify and secure key partners early on and build those relationships through the application phase. A major lesson learned for us is don't wait till the last minute to really start these conversations with folks. Start them early on and keep that relationship going. Make sure if there's a change in personnel with the organization that you're talking with about becoming a partner of the project, make sure you know that changing of the guard, so that you're not a few days before the application trying to fill in the blanks and that person you'd been communicating with is gone. So always keep those lines of communication open. It's important to consider when you're thinking about finding the right fit for those partnerships, what's the funding source here? We know from experience, the U.S. Department of Energy, they like to see Clean Cities collaboration. So, if you're thinking about a project, think about how you could incorporate the other Clean Cities coalition. It's not only going to help your project be more competitive, because you could say we've got great partnerships all around the country, but it also helps out the sister coalitions too, right? So anytime you're incorporating them on a project, that's funding for their coalition. So I highly encourage the Clean Cities collaboration there. We know with the US EPA that they like to see regional collaborations. So, if we're putting together a proposal with the US EPA, let's include the other regions in our proposal in some way. They don't have to play a huge role, but having some sort of collaboration shows the entity that you're applying for the funding for that you're interested in working together, and it's not just your territory. Also considering the type of project, does that partner make sense for a deployment project, or is this a research project? So that particular partnership doesn't make sense. So really thinking through the types of the projects is important as well. Next slide, Ann. So cost share matching funding. So Daniel spoke about this earlier as well. Is cost share required for the project? If the answer is no, fantastic. Your life just got a lot easier. If the answer is yes, identify that cost share early as much as you can. Really, what would be a strategic and smart position to put yourself in is find cost share in excess of what you need, and just start a spreadsheet and start to tally up who the potential cost share partners could be. That way, as things fall through, you have the backup ready to go. So identify it early and confirm it early. Get those commitments in. I think it's also important to mention that. Could we go back one slide? Sorry, Anne. It's also important to mention that cost share can make or break a project, which Daniel mentioned as well. I think, if you don't have the cost share for the project, it's simply just not going to be accepted in the review stage. Making sure you understand what's allowable and what's not in terms of cost share. And then very important is do not propose conceptual cost share. So funding that isn't secured. So if you're writing your proposal and there's this great source of funding that you are pretty sure is coming down the pipe, to your region, to your state, but it hasn't yet been secured, do not include that. That is a lesson learned that we were part of a project where that funding was not secured. It was conceptual. It was essentially a sure thing, and that funding did end up coming in, but it wasn't secured at the time of the application. So that project did not get funded. Next slide, Anne. Thank you. So gathering and collecting the data. This is a really important part. Daniel also spoke about this. So you're hearing a lot of this twice. It's really important stuff. I think it's important to hear it more than once. Make sure you create a tracking mechanism to manage and monitor the information that's needed. So our particular expertise here at Clean Fuels Ohio is the U.S. Department of Energy funding. There's a lot of paperwork that's required. So making sure that you understand that you understand in the funding opportunity announcement what is required, and then create a tracking mechanism. It could be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet where you have each of the partners in a column, and on the left-hand side, you've got the list of everything you need. And as soon as those things come in, you check it off the list and save it to a file structure. Also encourage you to consider using a shared drive like Google Drive. We've transitioned to that organizationally and streamline that pretty much with all of our projects, because it allows for that collaboration and for others to see, okay, that has come in, and you can make some of the folders private, so it doesn't have to all be accessible to everyone, but people can drag and drop their tasks right into that shared Google Drive. So highly recommend considering that. So really understanding what's needed for the funding opportunity. I've just listed here, a handful of things that came to mind: letters of support, letters of commitment. Those two are different. Budgets and budget justifications. Understanding at what point does a federal funding amount trigger a budget justification file versus just including them within your budget. Federal forms, there's the standard form 424, lobbying disclosures, etc. Environmental questionnaires, understanding how to submit those, the technical volume, the summary abstract, the summary slide, and then the foreign nationals. I think it's important to understand that paperwork is required of your organization, a subrecipient of yours, or a sub of a sub. If any federal funding or cost share dollars are being accounted for a project that has a foreign national working for them, that all has to be approved for the project. Next slide, Ann. Plan for submission. Okay, so making sure that you're pre-testing the system for submission at least a week ahead of time. There's nothing more frustrating than getting to application day and it's the morning and you can't get in, you've forgotten your login information, or you tried too many times and you're locked out. So test that system, test it often. How are you submitting? Understanding how you're submitting. Is it a portal? Are you simply emailing it? Is it in person? I think those days of in-person are probably gone, and email are fewer and far between as well. It seems like the transition to portal submissions is pretty much streamlined these days. Understanding, from your side, who is going to submit. It seems silly, but sometimes I think someone else is submitting something, but actually they thought I was submitting it. So making sure, is it a staff member that's submitting it? Is it a firm that's submitting it? Who's submitting it, and do they have the right login credentials is very important to understand. And also, this seems silly as well, but it's important. So understanding confirmation of submission. Is there an email that's going to come? Whose email is it going to that the confirmation is going to come to, and who has access to that? And then, or do you need to do a screen capture that says, thank you for your submission, that has a timestamp on it? I know after we submit a big proposal, I like to send out an email to our entire staff, sometimes the entire collaborative project team, or even our board of directors. And so it's good to make sure that you've gotten that confirmation that it's been submitted and there wasn't like a glitch in the system. Next slide, Ann. And yeah, that's it for me. So if you have any questions about the plan or the process, please feel free to reach out to me directly, but I'll stick on here for questions and answers as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Megan. So this ends the presentation portion of our webinar today, and we're going to move into a Q&A session. We just included this slide here as just kind of an overview of all the different types of questions when you're looking to start a project and work with a Clean Cities Coalition. And wanted to remind you all that this is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel at the end. So I'm going to stop my screen share at the moment so you can see all of our lovely faces. So welcome back, all of you. It's good to see you all. As far as, I'm going to ask a few questions here before I start getting into the Q&A questions in the portion. So the idea of the commitment letter, again, that is a big sticking point, and it's often very hard to convince a fleet or a business or an entity and their lawyers that indeed they are not committed to actually the funds, because when you're putting a number in it, it seems to give them really cold feet. Is there any other assurances that you all can give or advice you can give to potential prime project managers to how to overcome this? Just raise your hand if you want to answer. Daniel.
Sure. So there's nothing quite like, if possible, an in-person meeting with folks that you want to work with on a project. Take them to lunch, explain your organization's history, give them the context of the work that you're doing, and give them examples of successful projects that you've run in the past. Most of the time, these organizations are like us, slammed and way too busy to do kind of a lot of the contextual groundwork that's required to really understand who is this organization who's pitching an idea to me, and are they any good? So that's on you to be able to sell it to the organization you want to work with. And oftentimes it's enthusiasm that sells it. If you can demonstrate your organization's quality, then the rest is just up to you to prove that you're passionate about the work, that you're engaged in this more than just for a payday from the federal government. This is about doing good work in the communities that these places work in.
Fantastic.
Megan, looks like your hand's up too.
Yeah, so we also have a question about the Justice 40, and I see that Tyler wants to answer this question. Is it basically a box that you check, or and it gives you priority, or what is involved with this Justice 40 initiative, and why is it important to our applications?
I just want to pitch it back real quick. Megan, did you have something to add for the last question that you wanted to jump in
Yeah.
on? And then we jump to
I didn't see that.
I know this is a real a sticking point, and so I do want to add to what Daniel had shared. I think one thing that I like to do to ensure people that they're not necessarily the ones on the hook, even if they do provide a letter of commitment, I like to point right back to the terms and conditions. I'm all into the contracts, right? So I will share with them a terms and conditions like screenshot from a previous project that's funded under the same entity that clearly says that the project prime is on the hook for every element of this project. So that that is the language that the legal teams like to see, right? So that's what gives them comfort, is to see a previous contract. You know, it might not be that exact contract because that one's still in word negotiations or it hasn't been finalized yet, but point back to that and say, you can clearly see here, you providing a letter of commitment does, you know, is not holding your feet to the fire by any means. Like, let's collaborate, let's get this in, but look here, we, Clean Fuels Ohio, we're the ones on the hook as the project prime. So I just wanted to add that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Megan. Any more contributions on that before we move to Justice 40?
I'll just quickly add, I think the more that you can make this in just good business sense and in their interest is also really valuable. Their, you know, quid pro quo is off the table, but just an example is like an auto dealership might be really interested in installing DC fast charging, and they would love to not foot the entire bill. And so if they were offering, you know, a 10% cost share, that could be a fantastic opportunity for them to reach their goal simply by pledging the small amount that they want to do anyway. So I think that what they want to do anyway, little nugget, is that sweet spot, because if you can find it and you have the right partners, then we're all rowing in the same direction.
Thank you, Zach. All right, moving on. So Justice 40, Tyler,
Yes.
take it away.
So there was a question about what the Justice 40 means, and I just want to say that up front that it's not a dedication of 40% of the funds have to be used in underserved communities. The interesting thing is that the language is that the benefit of federal dollars have to be felt by underserved communities, which is a little bit of ambiguous language that I think with all the programs that we're going to see will be ironed out a little bit more in the specific details. We might expect that in this next May 13th minimum standards bit from the NEBU Funds. But that's kind of how the language reads, is that the benefit of federal dollars have to, or 40% of the benefit of federal dollars have to be felt by underserved communities. So it's not that the funding has to go specifically to projects in those communities. So again, a lot of ambiguity in that hopefully will get ironed out on specific programs. And I think Daniel has some stuff to add.
Yes, go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. You're right in pointing out the ambiguity of the J40 language. And even if you look at, so the NEVI program, which is going to be administered by state DOTs, so the federal government's going to be giving out money to state departments of transportation on the basis of their applications that are due, I believe, at the end of August. And then they're going to be developing their own plans to be approved by the federal government. If you look in the language that the instructional language that's provided to state DOTs about how energy and environmental justice needs to be incorporated into the state plans, I'll put it this way, it lacks a little bit of teeth. And so the way that states develop the J40 plans surrounding that program, just for example, I think it's going to really depend on the state and the amount of pressure that's put on them to integrate EEJ concerns, equity concerns into the plans. On that note, very quickly, honestly, I think as a Clean Cities coalition, I think that's our job right now, is to be making sure that the communities who have historically and who continue to fall through the cracks when it comes to sustainable transportation are prioritized by us. And so if we see state DOTs releasing NEVI program plans or other funding plans that don't attend properly to the equity considerations surrounding sustainable transportation, it's on us to fill in the gap and make sure that we're working with the communities that we want to see a higher standard of living, a higher quality of life, greater economic success, greater health outcomes, greater environmental beauty and strength. It's up to us to make that happen. And that involves working with the communities themselves and asking what they need. I'm a little bit concerned, honestly, that the huge investment that we're seeing in electric vehicle research is going to continue to go to the communities that already have the stuff that they need and not to the communities that don't. So that's my pitch. Come work with us and we can make underserved communities feel a little bit better about their place in the country.
Thank you, Daniel. And another thing, that way of looking at it is, to the people you contract with, who are you contracting with who are you giving the money to do the work to install the chargers or to deploy the vehicles? That can be a consideration as well. Don't just give it to the same players or the same people that you always work with. Make sure that you are considering the community and workforce development programs and so forth. There's a lot of ways that you can ensure that the benefits of this program get to everyone. Tyler?
And I want to add a little bit to kind of two things. Is one, that this is kind of a new direct focus in a lot of ways to these funding programs. While I think that, you know, Ann and I, and I'm sure Daniel and Megan and Zach have all had a very big interest in making sure that funds go out to those rural communities and those underserved communities in our territories. That's a big concern that we've kind of always had. As a very official like directive behind these funding programs, behind these efforts, it's pretty new. So there's a lot of learning happening kind of by all the players, by all the Clean Cities coalitions, and by all of us really, in how to actually make that work the best. So this is a fairly new official directive. And I think that also something that Anne mentioned, just to say it in a different way, that I think getting people on the ground involved actually in those communities with these grant programs is incredibly important. And if you are in a rural community or an underserved community and you're interested in projects, please reach out and tell us like, hey, this is what you can bring to the table with your local knowledge. We don't know what's happening in Carencro, Louisiana, which is a place that probably most people haven't heard of, nearly as well as the people who live there. So if you are there, we want to hear from you and help us do really well, just kind of in addition. And that's a way to make this stuff happen. And also, it is an actual priority that is listed in these grant programs to work with underserved and rural communities. So that is a big plus for any applications that come out of there. And to show that we're working with you, the actual people on the ground there, is a huge benefit as well. And then work with Clean Cities is also called out very specifically in basically all of these programs as adding weight to a program or to a project. So this can be a really winning partnership. So get involved early and get involved often is the kind of close there.
Yeah, and to wrap up the Justice 40, I heard a very good way of looking at this. Instead of just, you know, you've heard the teach a man to fish, you know, proverbs, you know, you feed him for a day, you know, if you give him a fish, but teach him how to fish, he can eat for a lifetime. Why don't we not only teach them how to fish, but teach them how to build a boat, how to run a crew? That's going to uplift the community more than just allowing the person to feed themselves. Let's uplift them so they can better themselves, have a better way of life and their community, and enrich their community and build employment in their community. So when you're building these projects, just keep that concept in mind. Now, the next question we have is, how can NGOs support transit agencies in a fleet transition and plan for these funding opportunities? Do we have, Megan or Zach, do you want to add something to that before Tyler pitches in?
Go ahead, Tyler.
Yeah, Tyler.
I think I'd make my kind of standard Clean Cities pitch. We have a lot of the networking that can be done. We know the players for a lot of, you know, the OEMs or the manufacturers that can provide the equipment. We have good relationships with utilities, especially if we're talking about electrification projects, and making those connections early is one of the biggest things that I think Clean Cities can really do for any of these fleet transition plans. It takes a lot of legwork to make sure that you can support this equipment, support the transition to fleet. A lot of the projects also require emissions modeling and the use of DOE or government tools to actually bolster your project. And that is stuff that us Clean Cities coalitions have often had a lot of work with. So kind of just the standard Clean Cities pitch of, we generally know who to talk to. I always like to say, if I don't know the answer, I know somebody who does know the answer. And that's kind of our biggest strength, is that networking, knowing who all the players are. We've been working in this for over 25 years now. So as far as institutional knowledge goes, I don't think there's anybody really better than Clean Cities for that as a national program. So yeah, making those connections with the different players that can get involved, looking at other programs that exist. We do a lot of information sharing across the entire national network of Clean Cities coalitions. So we often find somebody else who's already done it and not reinvent the wheel every single time. That is a huge thing that can give your project a leg up and make sure that it works really well the first time. So standard Clean Cities pitch of, we know who to talk to and we try to get it done well the first time.
Daniel?
Yeah. Tyler, yeah, absolutely. Everything you said, and just to kind of say a little bit more on the point of having a kind of institutional knowledge and historical knowledge of projects that have happened that have been successful, and also projects that haven't been successful. Honestly, when I am asked or brought onto a project, either internally or from an external stakeholder who wants to work on something with me, one of the first things I do is look around to see, okay, what's already worked either in our area or somewhere commensurable, and also what hasn't worked. And I want to bring in to the table the person who ran the project and it didn't work, and understand what failed, so that we know what not to do this time or what to do better, what to focus on this time around. And that's something that, as Tyler was saying, we have been doing this work. Tennessee Clean Fuels has been operating in Tennessee for over 20 years, and we have a rich history of working on projects and knowing about projects that are happening in our state that are either successful or not. And we will be able to bring many of those resources to the table if your organization requires it.
Thank you, Daniel. So as we wrap up this webinar today, I know a couple of us had some tips for the grants. So Megan, I want to give you an opportunity to share some of your favorite tips on having a great project, great program, or application.
Yes, and Anne, I don't have those pulled up. Did we have those somewhere on one of the slides? I apologize.
Oh, I know we had just discussed on email and so forth that we all had some tips. Anybody, while Megan's thinking, I'm sorry for putting you on the spot. Does anybody have
no problem.
Quick tips on your applications and lessons learned?
Sorry, I was muted. The most frustrating projects I have worked on are projects where communication has been lacking, one way or the other, whether it's from the people the subrecipients who might be doing implementation on the ground, not communicating with the project prime and not communicating changes in their action plans, or whether it's the project administrators not communicating successfully and providing the resources that are needed to the team to get the work done. I've seen a couple projects fall apart just because of that. Everything else was working, everything else was in place, and it was just the fact that people weren't talking. So think about when you're building your team and building your plan to make the project a reality, keep in mind how you're going to be communicating, how regular your communication is going to be, and how accessible you are to be able to answer the questions of the rest of your team. One of the things we're talking about for one of our big projects coming up is having office hours. Essentially, there's going to be a time, let's say 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, Monday through every Wednesday during the week, where one of our project managers will just be on call, sitting in a Zoom room, waiting for someone to come in and ask a question. Of course, they'll do other work if no one shows up, but we want to make ourselves available to be able to answer any of the questions that someone has right off the bat.
Fantastic. I know one of my lessons learned, I had a phenomenal, beautiful, perfect idea that was so all, it covered every single thing, every checkbox. What happened is the project got too complicated. It got too big. It got too unwieldy. And when you look at our staff size, it's like, do you really have the capacity to do this work right now? And some of the awarded projects are so simple. They didn't do all the dozens of things that ours was going to do, but they were simple, they were clear cut, and they were achievable. So keep that in mind. And I know Megan is ready now.
Yes, thank you, Anne. And actually, one of your tips about keeping it simple feeds right into one of my tips, which is keeping your statement of project objectives, the SOPO, simple. I think is really important. The more technical that you get in there, the more things that you commit to in there. That is really the document that the U.S. Department of Energy, in the case of how I'm referencing it here, that's the document that they're going to look back on and they're going to hold you to. So keeping that simple, making sure that there's a little bit of wiggle room in there so that you're not tying yourself to something that's unrealistic. So that was a good tip there. And then also, it seems silly, but have a non-technical reviewer review your technical volume before it gets submitted. I think something that makes sense in your mind might not make sense to the average reviewer. So there are folks that are on the technical review team for these funding opportunities. but they have technical experts, but there are also non-technical experts too. So make sure you're writing for an audience that can understand what you're putting together. And then the other one I mentioned during my presentation, and Daniel mentioned as well, is identify and secure that cost share early on. I can't emphasize enough how important that is.
Fantastic, thank you. And Zach, do you have any final comments?
I would say it's never too early to start talking. Like if you have a germ of an idea, socialize it, because I think that's some of the best ideas come from having conversations and collaborating. And you might find a person that has another half of the idea that pairs really well with yours. So I would say you don't have to necessarily have the entire project baked or scope baked before you're talking with people. That you just might want to collaborate with, or you just might want to socialize that idea with.
Thank you, Zach.
I want to add quickly to that, because Zach, that was a great point. Be prepared for grant programs that don't exist yet. If there is any project you want to do that is in any sort of alternative fuel world, or really anything else, and you just don't have the funding yet to do it, be thinking about that. Maybe have a list of running ideas that if you only had a little bit more money, you'd be able to get done, and just have that ready, and maybe take a little bit of time every month or so to just kind of think, who should we pull into this if funding becomes available? Because these things move very, very, very quickly. And the less time you have to prepare, the less appealing your project will be. And it is also like tons of pressure to get these funds out of the door as quickly as humanly possible. And that makes it much more likely for mistakes to be made or for bad projects to be funded. So having that preparation way in the front, just even thinking about what might happen is always a good idea.
Thank you.
Yeah, on that note, just as a concrete example of this, the EVs for Everyone Act just passed the federal legislature, and that's going to be a Department of Energy grant program to develop public housing EV car share programs. That DOE is months away from releasing that funding opportunity announcement, but I've already been on the phone 2 or 3 times today, just kind of sending out feelers about, hey, are you interested in this? Can we work together on this? Starting as early as possible is a key in the recipe to success.
Absolutely. It's calling to mind one of the cartoon movies that my kids watched when they were little. It's Find a Need and Fill It. So that's think about the needs. What needs do you have? What problems do we have? What do you need? Start writing it down, start thinking about it, and give us a call. So if there are no more questions or comments, this will conclude our webinar. Anything else? Fantastic. Well, thank you all for joining us here today. And thankfully, the weather held out for us here in Louisiana. And we look forward to seeing you all on one of our next Clean Cities webinars. This concludes the webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, folks. Pleasure to see all of you.